Good evening and welcome, folks. I'm Chris Graham, the editor of newmatilda.com, and this is the second in our series on the genocide being perpetrated in Gaza. My guest tonight is Nasser Mashni. New Matilda readers might remember him from a recent Q&A episode that blew up on social media, and we'll come back to that shortly. But apart from being a social media star, Nasser is also the son of a Palestinian refugee. He's the president of APAN, the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network, and a co-founder of Australians for Palestine. He's also a founding member of Olive Kids, a registered Australian foundation dedicated to improving the lives of Palestinian children through financial support, education and medical aid. Nasser lives in Melbourne, where he joins me this evening. Nasser, thanks for talking to me.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
It is Melbourne, isn't it?
No, I'm joining you from Wurundjeri lands, and I think it's important as a Palestinian speaking about Palestine to acknowledge our traditional owners here. And I said traditional, and I learned from Francesca Albanese, who did a fantastic tour, that we shouldn't be using the word traditional because it invokes some sort of past tense or, doesn't confer direct and current ownership. We should acknowledge the owners of this land, that it always was and always will be Aboriginal. Sovereignty was never ceded. And that just like Palestine will always be Palestinian land, this land will always be Aboriginal.
Amen. Well, I'm coming to you from Guringai land up in just north of Sydney. Yeah. We'll probably end up down that path at some point. As I mentioned earlier, my original area, my actual area of expertise in journalism is Aboriginal affairs, and if the conversation heads that way, which I hope it will at some point, we should talk about Israel as the settler colony, as the kind of part of the broader landscape.
That's where we're starting in the conversation.
That's what it is, yeah.
We're not going to end up there. We've got to start there.
Yeah, all right. Look, before we get there, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Because I think you're going to take us through what you call Palestine 101, which I'm very chuffed about. But before we do that, I'm keen to know a little bit about where you're from. Our readers want to know basically your background and your family's background, how you tie into the Palestinian cause.
Yes. So my dad's Palestinian. He was born in Mandate, Palestine. He was born in a Palestine that was magical. And I say magical because it was a period between the end of the Ottoman occupation and during the Mandate period and the start of the Zionist occupation. So there was a period in the middle there between, the end of World War I and the end of World War II and post horrors of the Holocaust before the UN decided to cut Palestine in two, if you will, where there was about 20 or 30 years where people were just Palestinian living under the British Mandate. There was still, a heavy Turkish influence, if you will. The fez hats were still about, the mustaches were quite Turkish or Ottoman. But Dad grew up in a magical Jerusalem where, Muslim, Christian and Jew, Baha'i, Samaritan, etc., were just Palestinian. And you could just walk, if you walked today even, through most of what is Israel or the land from the river to the sea, you'd have a tough time, most of the time, being able to pick out who was the Muslim, who was the Christian, who was the Jew. Certainly in some parts of 48 or the river to the sea, Israel and Palestine, you will find Ashkenazi Jews, Jews that migrated to Palestine just before World War II and post World War II that are, fair-skinned and blue-eyed, if you will. But the overwhelming majority of the people who live between the river and the sea are Arab-looking, Arab culture, and culturally Arab. Well, he grew up in that Jerusalem where, and I often tell the story to people, on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, Abraham, Avraham, and Ibrahim, that's Abraham in Arabic, English, and Hebrew, the father of the monotheistic religions that are, today fighting over that bit of dirt. All three of them played marbles together on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And on Friday, Ibrahim went to mosque, the Dome of the Rock, the Aqsa Mosque, where Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. On Saturday, Abraham went to temple or prayed at the Wailing Wall, which is, sits here where the Dome of the Rock sits there. And on Sunday, Abraham went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where Christians believe Jesus was crucified. So
Just
the last temple of
and
the last temple of the Hebrew Empire, the Dome of the Rock, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And if you were a crow and you flew that line, it's 400 or 500 meters. And on Monday, Abraham, and Ibrahim played marbles together. Fast forward 20 years into the mid 40s, and my father is part of the resistance fighting against Zionism and Jewish terror gangs, the Irgun, the Stern, the Haganah. These Jewish terrorist gangs were, committing all sorts of heinous crimes, whether it's the bombing of the King David Hotel or etc. And Dad was captured by some of these Jewish terrorist forces and held in a prison camp. It wasn't really a prison per se. And his girlfriend at the time helped him escape. A young Jewish Palestinian woman.
Wow.
She helped him escape. Fast forward from, that's sort of 46 to 66, 67. He ends up marrying my mum in Australia, meets her here, marries her. She's a Christian. Dad was a Muslim.
Yeah, wow.
So for me, I had the benefit of 2 Christmases, but it also meant I had Saturday school and Sunday school. I'd tell my dad, Dad, as Muslims, do we really need to go to Sunday school? And he'd be like, your mum wants you to go to Sunday school. When you're old enough, you'll decide what you want to be. But in between now and then, you'll go to Sunday school. And so I married a Muslim, raising our children Islamically. One of my brothers married a Catholic, and they're raising their children as Christian Orthodox. And my other brother is a secular agnostic sort of guy, but married a sort of a lapsed Catholic. So how you celebrate God is an individual decision. The challenge is when you decide that your God's the superior God and that God promised you a bit of dirt, and that bit of dirt was somebody else's when you got there. And that's the crux of the problem, is this notion of Zionism that is a Jewish homeland. And I remember on that Q&A show you were just talking about, I said, the need for a homeland I get after 100 years of persecution. Yeah, and that intergenerational trauma that we've suffered after 100 years. I get somebody after 2,000 years of intergenerational trauma of Holocaust, Russian pogroms, Spanish Inquisition, Crusades, and all the ills that have fallen upon the Jewish people. I understand the need for a Jewish homeland. The challenge is Zionism needs 3 things: a Jewish homeland, and then it needs my house, and then it needs to kick me in the head every couple of years.
Yeah.
If you look what that looks like today, it looks like what they're doing in Gaza. Now, you can't have a Jewish homeland if it means you have to take my house, and if it means you have to kick me in the head every couple of years, because that's not safety. That's superiority. That's racism. And that's what we've got in the state of Israel today. A country that is ruled by, arguably, I'd argue they're fascists, but under a theocracy that predicates, and elevates one of those Abrahamic faiths above all the others.
It's interesting. I think when you ask Australians, average Australians, what they think it is all about, a lot of Australians will say, oh, this has been going on for thousands of years, which is obviously not true. And they'll also say, this is about religion. And I was thinking about it today because it's obviously about land, but the religion is kind of inextricably tied up in it, in the sense that you mentioned the belief in a greater God. It's also, unfortunately, religion, Judaism, that believes they are the chosen people, that they are better, that they are a better people, and that God has promised them some land. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. What's your perspective? Is it just about land? Is it about land and religion, or is it something else?
Look, a big chunk of it's about power, Chris. Zionism, most Zionists are atheists. You know, the very first Zionists didn't believe in God, but they believed God promised them the land.
That's a convenient.
Yeah, they're not, you know, and the overwhelming majority of Zionists on earth are in fact not even Jewish. Yeah, like
Yeah.
President Biden, you know, constantly claims he's, you know, a Zionist.
Mm.
Kevin Rudd went in just before he ran against who did he topple to get leader and become prime minister?
Right. Howard.
No, in the Labor Party.
Oh,
Kevin Beasley. Was it
Simon
Kim
Green.
Beasley? He toppled?
Beasley, yeah.
Simon Green. Maybe Simon Green or Kim Beasley, one of the two. You know, he flew to Israel on Albert Dadon's jet. You know, Albert Dadon of the Beeson family fortune, jazz musician, etc., and founder of a number of, you know, Australia-Israel normalization type think tanks. You know, he went there and with yarmulke on, went to the Wailing Wall, and he's a devout Christian. There's no question about Kevin Rudd, but you know, he famously extolled it. You know, Zionism was in his DNA. Zionism was in his DNA.
Yeah.
And you know, this concept, you know, started off with a need for a homeland, and a homeland isn't necessarily a country.
Mm.
Yeah. So having safety, you know, and you would argue today, based on what's happening today in Palestine, historic Palestine, river to the sea, Israel, Palestine, that in fact the safest place to be a Jew is not there.
No, in fact, it's, I believe, officially the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew.
So, you know, I've said, I don't know how many times, you know, the only way that the Israelis get safety is by taking their foot off our throats.
Mm.
That if your safety is predicated on standing on my head, you're trapped here too.
Mm.
We're both trapped. I'm on the floor, but you're trapped with your foot on my head. And that taking your foot off my head, allowing me to stand up as equals, we can move forward. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, obviously, Chris, but that's what tomorrow has to look like. You know, the belief that you can just cage a people, as Israel has done for almost 17 years now in Gaza, 360 square kilometers, 2.2 million people, with a population density that would see Australia at 45 billion people. 45 billion people. Imagine traffic in Sydney. You know, if our population was suddenly 200 times greater.
Yeah.
That's what Gaza is.
Yeah.
For every human being you see, imagine 200 of them. That's what Gaza's population density is. No food, no gas, no electricity, no water for 60 days. But for the 16 years before that, Israel would determine the daily calorific intake required and only let that much food in.
Yeah. Which is a war that's undeniably one of the many war crimes that they've been caught doing. I think that was in about 2008, 2009, or might have been earlier, 2006. Sharon, I think, was involved in things in that caloric intake, you know, putting the restriction on it.
05 was the disengagement, and the disengagement was how much does it cost for us to have 25,000 settlers living amongst 1.5 million Palestinians. And they went, the cost is just not worth it, you know, security, etc. And so he disengaged from Gaza, and he took all of these, you know, messianic settlers and put them into settlements all over the West Bank, on top of the most arable land, on top of the water aquifers, and gave them just the best possible outcome. And then they sealed Gaza up. Sealed it up.
I've been to Hebron, and actually, I should make the I should inform this. I actually went to Hebron with APAN, the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network, which you're the president of. I went with them with Lisa Arnold in 2016. We went to Hebron, and Hebron, not really comparable to Gaza. We tried to go to Gaza and we weren't allowed, obviously, but that same sort of situation as earlier Gaza, where they have Jewish settlers living in this area, and the security that the Israelis imposed to protect a very small number of Jewish settlers who some of the stories of the violence there is extraordinary, perpetrated by the settlers, pouring hot water, boiling water down onto Palestinians as they go about their business. It's just.
I mean, you would have walked down Shahada Street.
I did.
It used to be the main thriving thoroughfare. It's one of the biggest cities in the West Bank.
Yeah, I did, and it's now. It looks like it's a war zone. It looks like an war zone. Yeah, It's one of the more shocking places I've been. You walk through those big steel gates at the end of the street, which look like the sort of gates you would have in a prison. To get in and out of a prison. And it's purely there to control purely the movement of Palestinians and to protect Jewish settlers.
So. And what you've got there is like 250,000 Palestinians and 2,000 troops for 300, 400 settlers.
Settlers, yeah.
And these settlers have taken over houses and stuff and
them too. They didn't buy them; they just took them.
Took them, yeah. Correct. They took them. In that street, the shopkeepers have put mesh over the street because these Israeli settlers on the top would throw dirty nappies down on people. Hurl rocks at them.
Throw boiling water, they can get it through the mesh. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just I think totally sickening.
Yeah, I was, of all the places in the West Bank I saw, probably Hebron was the one that shocked me the most. Although
the most shocking thing you can see in the West Bank is Hebron.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we saw other individual shocking things where Israeli soldiers had just been through and bulldozed businesses and bulldozed homes, in Area C or Area A. They didn't care where they were bulldozing it, but or why. They just, and doesn't seem to be any reason. There's no warning. They just come through and bulldoze someone's house. I don't think Australians can really fathom that and really understand that because it's so foreign to you wouldn't expect authorities to come through and bulldoze your house for no reason with no warning.
So that comes back. So it's important that we speak to that, Chris, because that's often the disconnect that the lay Aussie thinks this is thousands of years old. But what we need to do is think about it in the context of, First Fleet coming to Australia, Christopher Columbus going to North America, Captain Cook going to Aotearoa, New Zealand, that a superior, quote unquote, civilization, and that superiority wasn't because they were better people or whatever. They just had better guns. That's what superior civilizations look like when they colonize other places. Better weaponry, not guns, better weaponry. So when Australia was settled and it was conquered, it went all the way through to the White Australia policy, through to Indigenous people being classified as flora and fauna in the Constitution, to breeding out the Indigenous people, and that's what it looked like here. It looked like that in New Zealand, Aotearoa, the North Americas and the South Americas. That you want all of the land with as few Indigenous people as possible, and then you want to try and find a way to breed them out, destroy their language and culture, and what it looks like, despicably in most places, is get them drunk, get them hooked on welfare, etc. And so you have a despised Indigenous population, and you see in its worst situation the incarceration rates, the child detention rates, the child removal rates that exist here in this continent, in New Zealand, in North America. The numbers are so similar. The difference between those settler colonial projects and Israel is that they were done a couple of 100 years ago to 500 years ago, and the job was complete. The job was complete. and when I say the job was complete, you get to a point where they were 100% of the population, and now they're, micros. In the case of North American Indians, they'd be 0.0 something percent.
Yeah, less than a percent. Yeah,
less than a percent. Here, our Indigenous brothers and sisters are, sub 3 in the early 2s.
Yeah, 3.2 or thereabouts.
Thereabouts. In Aotearoa, there's significant chunks of them, but as I understand it, you might know better, Chris, but I don't think there's actually a pure blood Maori left. I think that everybody's had it, anyway, irrespective.
I'm actually part Maori, so
okay.
I'm definitely not 100%. I got a lot of Irish and Scottish. Yeah.
But then you go to Palestine, and the settler colonial project that was there. I mean, look, the reality is, if we go back to that 101 place, everybody knows Lawrence of Arabia. They've all heard the story. And for 400 years, up until 1917, the Arab world was occupied by the Ottomans, were part of the Ottoman Empire. And Lawrence of Arabia came to the Arabs and he went, Arabs, fight with me. And when we beat the Axis, which was, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany and the Ottoman Empire, against the Allies, which was, Australia, France, England, and America. Italy a couple of times, they changed sides. Was that World War II? Whatever way. When we beat the Axis, we'll give you your independence. That was a pretty good story for the Arabs, and the Arabs joined Lawrence, and we got Lawrence of Arabia, and there was the charge of the Light Horse Brigade into Beersheba, where Palestinians were used as cannon fodder against the Turks, and when they ran out of bullets, well, the Aussies charged across in the last great cavalry charge of history. And that charge went all the way from Beersheba all the way to Jerusalem and then on to Damascus, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. And the Arabs were ecstatic. We were free of the Ottoman Empire and we we're going to get countries. And we did. The British and the French cut up, Arabia into protectorates, but they went, it was like Oprah Winfrey, Chris. You get a country, you get a country. So Lebanon got a country, Syria got a country, Jordan got a country, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, everybody got a country. And they went, Palestinians, you can have a mandate. And we went, what's a mandate? They've gone, don't worry about it, we'll explain it later. But everybody else has got a country. What we didn't know was that the British had promised for support during World War I, that Lord Balfour had promised a Jewish homeland to Baron Rothschild in the infamous Balfour Declaration.
Yeah.
Where he said in 1917, His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, notwithstanding nothing should be done to prejudice the inhabitants that are already there. Let me tell you something, Lord Balfour. I'm in Australia. We were prejudiced.
Yeah.
So this Balfour Declaration promised, so the British promised Palestine to European Jews without asking us, after Lawrence said, fight with us and we'll give you a country. And that was, one person giving another person's house to a third person. That's 1917. So 105 years ago, yeah? And then we're like, hold on, what the hell is this? There's always been Jewish connection to the land. No Palestinian denies Jewish connection. And if there was a way to actually extract DNA and put it on a time chart and work out what we were, and you went, okay, how many people, from biblical times and perhaps even pre-biblical times to today, how many people have been through that land? Yeah, because aside from Moses and Abraham, all of those Old Testament prophets, they've all been there. And so back then there was the Canaanites, and there'd been Jebusites and Philistines and Anatolian, Lydian Greeks, and been Hebrews, the Amorites, Edomites, and Nabateans, Aramaeans, Romans, the Arabs, Western Crusaders, the Ottomans, the British, and now the Hebrews are back. Now, if you go through all of the people that have been there, I know how, I've watched enough Game of Thrones to know what happens, Chris, is that when I conquer, we kill enough of the blokes, marry the women / rape the women, unfortunately. And then the kids are ours. And, what happens is we come along and say, we believe in the sun god. And the other lady goes, we believe in the moon god. So off with his head. Number 2, moon god, off with his head. Number 3, I was always the sun god guy. I'm glad you guys are back.
I've always found the sun god. Yeah.
And then, then the next guy comes and he's the star god guy. And the moon god guy goes, no, we're moon, off with your head, moon god. I was always a star guy too.
Yeah.
And you go through all of those, dozens. And one time I did it all, Chris. I reckon there's 3 dozen different empires that have been through Palestine. Yeah.
Mm.
And you go, how the hell is anyone can claim that they singularly, out of that whole timeline, singularly, are the sole and only owners of? And that's what Zionism says. Yeah. Zionism says, out of all of those people that have been there, we are the only ones that are entitled to it.
Yeah, because God told us as well. That's part of the reasoning. To give people the timeline, we're talking about 3,000 years ago, aren't we? Is that?
We're talking 5,000 years. I mean, like the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, all that. These are at the times pre-Greek Empire. Yeah, this is like when the pyramids were getting built. I like only a short walk away, unless you're Moses, who spent 90 years in the Sinai. Yeah.
I liken it. I've kind of had this realization. I liken it to Australians, First Fleet families, and I've got Māori heritage, but I'm an adopted Australian, and I am a second fleeter, I think. So, wow. And like a lot of Australians, I have First Fleet ancestry or Second Fleet ancestry. It would be like me going back to England and saying, well, 250 years ago, my people got expelled from England. I am back. The land is mine. And not only do I claim that land, but I drive the people who currently occupy that land off their land. I slaughter them, and those that I don't slaughter, I expel. And then now it's my land. And then I annex it and claim it's mine. That's what's happened in Israel, and that is exactly what it would be like.
You're 100% right, but I think that there's just a slight. You're 100% right, but there is a slight difference there, Chris, because I'm a AAA rolled gold Palestinian, and I say AAA rolled gold because I'm Western educated. I still look like them, but I sound like us. Yeah. And I am the overwhelming minority of Palestinians. So if Chris goes back to Wales or Scotland or Ireland or wherever Chris's ancestors were from and says, I want my house back, you've got a house here. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians are not me with a house here. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians live like they do in Gaza, at risk of death at any time, unstable income, refugees, etc. So they don't have the security or quote unquote what most Australians with British or Anglo history do have, which is a house here. And so when we say I'm gonna go back and get my house there, we can say it in an academic way as if there's a because you've got a house here. But the overwhelming majority of Palestinians are living in refugee camps without ID, without nationality, without opportunities for citizenship, without the opportunity to vote for the system that controls every bit of every day of their lives. And so they're living a despised life. So when they say we want to go home, home actually has a connotation that is beyond the fabric of a bricks and mortar. Home is actually connection to something and belonging. And that's what's been denied Palestinians.
I actually met Palestinians in Burj al Berejna, which is a refugee camp in Beirut. Lebanon. We'll talk about it shortly because it has a particularly dark history. But Palestinians who wear a key on their on a chain, and it's the key from their home.
Here's our key, mate.
Oh my God! There you go. It's extraordinary. Yeah. And for
just on that, Chris, while I've got these keys,
explain what that is.
You can see that this is. My father was expelled from Palestine in 1948. This is soil from underneath a olive tree that I don't know how many great-grandfathers planted, because he always worried that he would die in exile and that he would have no connection to his dirt. Now, the top of that soil we threw onto his grave when he was buried here so that he would be connected to Palestine.
Oh, wow.
Now, this bit of soil, this key, every Palestinian has this story. There's 14 million of denied this, our right, this justice. So he collected it in 1986. There you go.
Oh, wow. Can you explain to people the olive, briefly, the link to olive trees? Because I only recently came to understand this, and I always wondered, what is it with Arabs and olives? Like, why do you like olives so much? But I didn't realize the importance of the trees, their age, or that they're I'm told that you'd know much better than me, but they're actually handed down through generations.
Yeah. So, I don't know that it's uniquely Palestinian, this concept that what one plants and granddad plants the olive tree so that his grandson can reap the fruits. But many parts of Palestine are really quite biblical in their look. Stony, gravelly, hilly, and the olive tree you put in the least arable land. Most arable land you use for tomatoes, and yearly turnover crops, whether it be barley or flour. And the olive tree is planted in those gnarly places. And it is the most productive tree, in the sense of A, doesn't need water, B, will grow anywhere, C, every bit of it is used. So when the olive is harvested, it's crushed, and the oil obviously becomes olive oil. When an olive is crushed, in the oil there's like what floats to the top is becomes like a paste, so that becomes soap. The pit becomes a briquette that gets crushed into briquettes that is used for heating and cooking later. The trees are pruned every year, and those prunings and leaves, because it's oil, are the most wonderful kindling for a fire whenever you might need one. And so the tree just keeps producing, and the older it is, the better the oil is. And it's there's a tree in Jerusalem that's mentioned in the Bible. It's thousands of years old. The olive trees don't die. And you actually see so many Israeli settlements, illegal settlements, where they have these really amazing olive trees with trunks that are, 2 or 3 meters in circumference, and perhaps even more, where they've been pulled out of, ancient olive orchards, groves, and, put in as if we've been here forever. But this tree just sits on its own in a roundabout, orphaned and torn from its ancestral place. People like my father, refugees that were torn from their land and scattered throughout the world. So it's the Palestinian connection to the olive tree is about, its steadfastness, its roots and holding on, its utility. And there's a famous a poem, Mahmoud Darwish, a famous Palestinian poet, and he said, if an olive tree knew what happened to the hands that planted it, it wouldn't produce oil, it'd produce tears of blood. So no, the connection, 100 years ago, the majority of Palestinians in Palestine were a rural people. And the connection to the dirt was through their farms and through their crops and through their herds, and whether that was sheep or cows or goats or and the crops they made. So.
I think you've got well, not a video, a Palestine 101, a kind of presentation. I probably skipped ahead a bit, have I, or caused you to skip ahead a bit?
So I'll just very quickly go back to that all that timeline of all of the cultures and all of the empires that went through the Holy Land, back to pyramid days. And the concept of Zionism saying that we're going to pick out one, bring it all the way to the front, and then elevate it over all of those other cultures and all those other religions and all those other peoples and say it is the supreme one. And if you actually believe that in Jewish supremacy over all of those cultures and all of those religions in a land that had so many, you're a Jewish supremacist.
Yeah.
You're a Jewish supremacist. And there's only one word for that, and that makes you a racist. Now, go back to that mandate Palestine bit and say there was everyone in Palestine was Palestinian before Israel was created.
Mm.
Yep. So everybody was Palestinian. Some of those Palestinians were Muslims, some of them were Christian, some of them were Jews, some of them were Samaritan, some of them were Baha'i, some of them were Armenian Christians, some of them were Shia, tens of religions in the Holy Land. That's why it's the Holy Land. But if you go back to 1946, and I'll bring up this very first map, you go back to 1946, and this is what the land looked like. This is historic Palestine from the river to the sea. Arabs owned 94% of the land.
Mm.
And at this point, just before partition happens, and partition gets suggested in 47, actually gets violently happens in 1948. 94% of the land is Arab owned, and we are 2/3 of the population. When I say we, I mean at this point, not Jewish, everybody else.
Mm.
The Zionist project from Zionism's founding in 1897 to 1946 had bought land. There were absentee landlords, and they bought land, and they at this point owned 6% of the land. But from those early migration periods through to now, post-Holocaust, we're talking now, and the world's guilt for allowing Hitler to rise, and the most violent form of anti-Semitism ever known, and the crimes of the Holocaust, the world says we've got to do something. Now, Europe had turned away boats and ships, and Jews were being forced or channeled here. Many of the Jews of Europe post-Holocaust wanted to come to Australia. Overwhelmingly, they wanted to go to the United States, but they wanted to come to places like Australia and the UK and other countries. They really weren't that keen on going to, backwards Arab country. So here we were 2/3 of the population owning over 90% of the land. In 1947, the UN, which at the time, like today, there's almost 200 countries in the United Nations. Back then, the UN was around 50 countries. I'm just trying to think. Around 50 countries. Overwhelming majority of those 50 countries were colonial countries. They were Belgium, France, England, Australia, the United States, and the world. Then the United Nations, these 50-odd countries, decided we should partition Palestine. And the concept of partition was we should have two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. Now remember, we were 2/3 of the population owned 94% of the land. And these 50-odd countries decided to have a vote, and the vote was like 30, 10, 10. 34, 10 abstentions, and 10 against them. And no surprise, the 30-odd countries that said partition were, Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, all of these colonial countries. Yeah, that's the right thing to do, just cut a joint up. So they went, you own 90% of the land and you're 2/3 of the population. We're going to give you 45% of the land. 45% of the land, and we'll give 55% of the land to the Jews. Not such a good plan if you're us. What we didn't know was, so the Britain is, we're still under the mandate, the British mandate at this point. What we didn't know, aside, by this time, the Balfour Declaration was well known to us. What we didn't know was just how violent and evil Zionism was, and what that was going to mean to us. And the conspiracy that was on, the fix that was on between the British and the Zionists at this point. So I mentioned earlier about the Irgun, Stern and Haganah, these Jewish terrorist forces. They were being trained, they were being equipped by the British. We, the Arabs, had World War One, 303, bolt action rifles. They had the latest in. They had an air force in 1947.
And this
Jewish
is
terrorist forces.
This is still British mandate Palestine. So Palestine,
British mandate Palestine.
British.
We're talking British mandate Palestine, but when the mandate ends, the Brits hand over the keys to the Zionists.
Yeah, they say out. Yeah.
Yeah. So they leave May 14, May 15, 1948. This is suddenly the Jewish terrorist forces, State of Israel is declared. Now they're the Israeli army, but they've actually got an army. They've got tanks and airplanes and stuff, and we're going click, click, bang, click, click, bang, click, click, bang, and then going brrr.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening, so here's the partition plan. The Israelis have the Jewish terrorist forces come up with Plan Dalet. And there's a book I would commend to anyone who's looking for a 101. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's written by Ilan Pappé. He's an Israeli Jewish historian, and he finds these archival notes. They talk about what we need to do, and what we need to do to create a Jewish state is where we're a Jewish minority. And how do you make a Jewish democracy where you're a Jewish minority? You have to demographically engineer the outcome. You have to demographically engineer a Jewish majority. Now, if 2 out of every 3 people is not Jewish, and you want a Jewish majority, you've got to get rid of some people. And Plan Dalet actually talks about how to do that. And it detailed every Palestinian village throughout historic Palestine, from the river to the sea, who the leaders were, who had been bought, the conspirators and the turncoats, where this village should go. And so villages in the north of Palestine were surrounded from the south, east, and west. They went in and went, okay, we've got to go get Chris. He's the leader. Shoot Chris, shoot Bob, and shoot Mary. And then tell everybody else they've got an hour, otherwise they're going to get shot. And we're forcing that village north. And so the massacre started in that yellow dot in Deir Yassin on the 8th of April, 1948, where at least 200 Palestinians were killed and massacred. And there's some horrible stories. We talk about, babies in the oven and stuff. This is the start of it there. And chillingly, they didn't kill everybody in the village, Chris. They killed enough to make everybody else terrorized. And they sent some north and said, tell them we're coming tomorrow. They sent some east and said, tell them we're coming tomorrow. They sent some south and said, tell them we're coming tomorrow. And then those Jewish terror gangs went away. And massacre after massacre, and they would just give everybody a day more. And in the next year, 750,000, 90% of the Palestinians who were indigenous to Palestine were ethnically cleansed from what was Palestine. Over 500 villages were bulldozed to make sure that the Palestinians couldn't return. So at the end of middle of 1949, there was an armistice, peace, if you will. An armistice was signed with Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. And what ended up after that was this, what we call the Green Line, which is carved out West Bank, and that went under Jordanian control, and the Gaza Strip went under Egyptian control. So those 750,000 Palestinians that used to live in this white bit ended up either in these two green bits or in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Egypt, in what we call the collar countries. The Palestinians that remained inside Israel, and about 100,000 remained inside Israel, they were under martial law for almost 20 years, with no rights to vote, home before 10 p.m. Everything that you might imagine from martial law. In 1967, there was another war, and that's when Israel conquered the rest of the West Bank and the rest of historic Palestine. They conquered West Bank and Gaza Strip. In fact, they took the Sinai off Egypt and the Golan Heights off Israel. And then from 1967, the Israelis started building settlements all over the West Bank and Gaza. And these settlements are dotted all over the place, and they sit on the most arable land and the water aquifers. And then from 1967 to today, they started creating security zones. So the whole of the Jordan Valley is a security zone. You're not allowed in there. These settlements have protection areas. So there's all these little chunks of what Palestinians are allowed to, where they live in areas A, B, or C, where Area C is full Israeli military control. Area A is Palestinian control, and Area B is a hybrid model.
Yeah, somewhere.
And then what we have today, which is Israeli-only bypass roads, settlements everywhere, the expansion of Jerusalem's municipal borders to include and encircle Jewish settlements, but exclude Palestinian cities, whose center of life has always been Jerusalem. And so this is what's left of what was supposed to be, if you were, old enough like you and I are, Chris, to remember Oslo, when they were supposed to have two states, and this was supposed to be the two states. And the green bits that are West Bank and Gaza Strip are 22% of historic Palestine. And that was what we were supposed to get on that White House lawn handshake in 1993, which is 30 odd years ago now.
Yes, Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, or
yeah. Well, that was another Oprah Winfrey moment, Chris. Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and
Bill Clinton, I think.
Yeah, Bill Clinton, Yitzhak Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, and another Israeli prime minister. They'll come to me soon. But everybody got a Nobel Prize. You get a Nobel Prize. You get a Nobel. So Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, the three of them got Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
For making peace finally. And here we are 30 years later, and this is what Palestine looks like, and what the Gaza Strip is. Every Palestinian, wherever they are on earth, is controlled in one way or another by Israel. And I say, here I am, an Australian Palestinian. The apartheid system that Israel runs has a control over me. If I want to visit my father's ancestral birthplace, I have to ask them to go. I don't think I'm going to get a yes this time.
No, I think you
probably not. The biggest impact on my family, Chris, was my father's dying wish, which was to be buried next to his mother.
Yeah. And she's buried
but he's buried here in Australia.
Oh.
And when we knew he was dying, and we made a phone call to the Israeli embassy and said, "What's the process of repatriating a Palestinian?" They asked me for my dad's ID number. I said, "Well, he doesn't have an Israeli-issued ID number. He was born before Israel was created in the 20s, and there's got to be a process to get him back." And they've gone, no, and hung up. And I thought we'd been disconnected, Chris. I'm like in this crazy thing trying to work out how to get my dad buried. He's still alive, Yeah. So I called back. I said, "Oh, we got disconnected." And the guy said, "We haven't disconnected." I hung up on you. "There's no way your father's going back," and hung up again. So that's apartheid on us here. All those Palestinian deaths that have happened in Gaza since the 7th of October, every one of those people that's died has got an Israeli-issued birth registry number. The population registry of every Palestinian inside historic Palestine is controlled by the Israeli Ministry for Palestinian Births.
Mm.
We all use the Israeli shekel. When I say we all, the Palestinians. Entry, exit, egress, tax, Wi-Fi, not Wi-Fi, cellular connection, everything is controlled by Israel. In the land, from the river to the sea, there's 14 million people. 7 million of them are Jewish and 7 million of them aren't.
Mm.
If you're Jewish, you get to vote and you get the very best of what Israel's got to offer. There's 1.5 million Palestinians that are Israeli citizens, and they get to vote, but they get to vote and theoretically participate in a democracy that is Israel. But there are over 60 laws that prejudice them.
Mm.
And those laws are based around the principle that Israel is a Jewish state. So you can be a citizen, but you can't have Jewish nationality. So there's a law called the nation-state law, and it says that the right to self-determination in Israel is for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. So you can have citizenship, but not nationhood as an
not full nationhood. Yeah,
not nationhood, and that and it exerts itself in so many different ways, Chris. You know, one of my dear friends, she's a Palestinian Muslim. She met a guy who's a Malaysian Hindu, and you know they got married via Zoom because he couldn't get there because he was from Malaysia, and they have to live in Australia. You know, they can't live there. But if you were Jewish and you married in Australia and you married a French Jewish girl, you could both go to Israel, get citizenship, get a sponsored government funded house in an illegal settlement, excuse me, in the West Bank. But you're 200 years here, and she's, God knows how long she's been in France, but because you're Jewish, both get to live in Israel.
I mentioned earlier when I went to Beirut, I to the Borj al Berezna refugee camp, which is about 50,000, predominantly Palestinian, about up to 75,000 now, including Syrian refugees. I met a lady there who was expelled from Israel in 1948 in the Nakba. She was a very young, she was a toddler when she was expelled. She's never been back since. So she was in her 50s. She's lived her whole life stateless in a refugee camp in Beirut, where she has no rights at all, really, no rights to work. She has no passport. And it struck me that I was on my way to Palestine at the end of that week. I'm allowed to go to Palestine, but she's not. And it's her homeland, and she's not allowed to enter it. She's not only not allowed to live there, she's not allowed to enter. Israel will not let her through the door, just for a visit. So, she since being ejected as a baby, her feet have never touched the soil. Is how she.
Well, my dad went back in '93, just after Oslo was signed. Went visited some family in Egypt. Mum and Dad went in through Gaza. And the guy at the checkpoint asked them where they were from, and my dad said Jerusalem, and he said, "Well, not anymore. Where are you from?" And Dad pulled out his Australian passport, and the guy that was standing next to him went, "Oh, you're Aussies," in the thickest Australian accent, you know, in Israeli battle fatigues and whatnot. He was a boy from Bondi.
From Bondi.
This guy from Bondi was in charge of deciding whether my dad was allowed home. 19-year-old conscript, or you know, I don't know, holiday army experience. Deciding whether my dad, you know, who was at the time, you know, in his mid 50s, whether he should be allowed to go back to Jerusalem.
Can you explain to people who might not understand
this issue, because I know you said it tonight, and I've seen you say it on Q&A and on other programs, that Palestinian people don't deny the indigeneity of Jews to Palestine. But can you explain to people how is it that a French Jew can move to and live in Palestine, but a Palestinian who lived in Palestine can't come back to Palestine? And how does that French Jew have a claim to land? They're from France or from Morocco or from...
Well, like you said, could you go back to Wales or Scotland or Ireland 250 years after being a second fleeter and say, get out of my house?
Yeah. Well, not even get out of my house, get out of your house. It's now my house. I didn't live here. I'm claiming this land, which is what most Jews have done in Israel. They've not gone back to a house they had 3,000 years ago. They've gone back to a house they've decided looks like a good house, and they've claimed that. I mean, that's Hebron.
Yeah. And in fact, Hebron, so there was...
there
were Jewish people in Hebron.
There were.
And, so in 1948, when the Jordanians came there, those Jews were kicked out, and Palestinians that were kicked out of Jerusalem ended up here. And we should talk about what Israeli courts allow for Jews that were kicked out in 1948 to use the Jewish court system to get their houses back. But the same court system won't allow Palestinians to get their houses back. Right? Yeah. That's another part of the apartheid. The apartheid works perfectly if you're a Jewish person. So remembering that Zionism wants this Jewish homeland, it went and picked this one culture out of the 30 that were sitting there and said, we are the sole and only and highest form of ownership over this land. That to be a Jewish state, it needs a Jewish majority. And so it always is seeking the immigration of Jews from diaspora. And so there are all sorts of incentives for French Jews, Australian Jews, Moroccan Jews, Jews from all over the world to perform aliyah, return, and to go to Israel, because they're really keen on having a Jewish majority. Because in the land from the river to the sea, they are now like 48%. Non-Jews are 52%. To the point where, after the fall of the Soviet Empire, in a desperate need to Judaize historic Palestine, Israel, Palestine, they let a whole bunch of Russian Jews come in, I was in the Galilee, and for those that are Christian or went to enough Sunday school like I did, Jesus of Nazareth, he's from the north of Palestine. He was born in Bethlehem before going as a refugee into exile. If you're in the Galilee, which is in the north of Palestine, where there are many still Palestinian Christian towns around Nazareth, if you go there now, in the rush to get all of these Russian Jews into Israel to whiten the joint up, quote unquote, and get more Jews in, a few people with really tenuous links to Judaism came in. There's some churches that run Orthodox Russian services in Nazareth.
Oh, say that again.
Orthodox Russian services.
Right.
So they have Sunday Mass in Russian because these, people wanted to leave Russia, obviously. Yeah. Post Glasnost and, the fall of the Berlin Wall and stuff. And they went, we're taking Jews. And they went, yeah, I'm Jewish. And they've ended up in Israel as Israeli citizens. And many of them gone, we kind of like the other Jesus, So they
call it a return, though, don't they? They
got home now.
Return.
So we have this, this desperate need when, because as a settler colony, it didn't do the job. So you've got historians like Ilan Pappé, who I spoke about earlier, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, there are revisionist historians, and they're called, this school of historian in Israel is called revisionist historians, who go, what we did was a sin, we need to account for it. The only way for restorative justice is to accept it and then to work through that. And then you have the other sort of revisionist historian who goes, no, we just didn't do the job correctly. In 1967, 1948, it took a year and a bit to get the ethnic cleansing of Palestine to get through, to get rid of all the green out of the white, yeah? In 1967, when the rest of historic Palestine was conquered, it happened in 6 days. And so the school of thought from these other revisionist historians is our tanks were too fast for their buses. Yeah. So the tanks got from here to here, but all the people were behind. The tanks needed to be slower. And so you have a look at the situation where we've got in Gaza today. And, if you're a Palestinian and a Palestinian who studies history and a Palestinian who understands what Zionism's ultimate manifestation looks like, and that's no one that isn't Jewish from the river to the sea. Yeah. That's what Zionism's ultimate manifestation or hope is. A river to the sea that has only Jewish people, what's happened to Gaza is a continuation of the Nakba that happened in 1948, 75 years ago, but where my father was pushed out at the end of a bayonet, and the dignity that might have been afforded that sort of ethnic cleanse, because there was people who resisted and they died and other people were screaming, but you knew what was happening. What's happened now in Gaza, where they've bombed every single school, every university, so there's no education. The school year has been cancelled in Gaza, where half the population is under 18. Over 1 million kids attend school. There is no school year now. And just on that, Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, Bethlehem's cancelled Christmas.
Oh.
Bethlehem's cancelled Christmas. So in Gaza, where there is not a school, there is not a functioning hospital, there is no functioning civil society or civil infrastructure. There's no roads. Desalination plants are destroyed. Every level of infrastructure that 60% of housing accommodation no longer exists. Yeah. So if you're driving down your street and you see number 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's only 4 houses left. Those other 6 people need to live somewhere now. That what's actually happened is that for the best, must be a generation, close to 2 million Palestinians have to be somewhere else. Are they at Syria? Are they at Damascus Primary School or Cairo Primary School or Melbourne Primary School or Toronto Primary School, wherever they are, for a generation? And then you go, okay, there was 2.2 million Palestinians in there. 1.6 million of them are refugees from the first Nakba in 1948. They were living in refugee camps. A day's walk home, 2 days walk to their ancestral birthplace where their keys should still unlock a door. They've lived that squalor for 75 years. Now they have to go somewhere else for a decade while the schools and hospitals and roads get rebuilt. And hypothetically you're here in Melbourne or in Sydney. Why would you go back? You've got temporary protection here or a way to citizenship or residency, and wherever that might be in the rest of the world. Why would you go back? Because the only people that will go back are the people who actually owned Gaza, the actual Gazan Palestinians that had houses when the Nakba happened, and they came and their cousins went, okay, you can build a house there and whatever, but you're going to have to pay rent. The only people that go back are Gaza. And so you go, in theory, what was 2.2 million Palestinians might, in a decade from now, be less than 500,000. And that sort of, a grenade, to a bang 10, that this Nakba is a slow burn Nakba. We've made the joint uninhabitable and, in fact, facilitated what many Zionists call the 3-state solution. And that is all of Gazan Palestinians end up in Egypt, and that's the start. And the second stage is all of the Palestinians in the West Bank end up in Jordan. And from the river to the sea, there are only Jews. That's the three-state solution.
Mm.